and welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
Our guest speaker today is Dr. Claire Willis, Research Fellow and Exercise Physiologist. Welcome, Claire. How are you?
I'm great, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
No problem. It's our pleasure. We're really excited to talk to you today. How are you, Dana?
I'm very well, thank you, Ash. It's lovely to be here again, talking to some great people. How are you?
I am well, thanks.
Oh, love it. I'm a bit nervous for your question because as you've probably heard lately, guys, Dr. Ash is the icebreaker queen.
It's a doozy today.
Okay.
Everyone get your vocal cords ready.
Oh.
My question to you is, what is your go-to karaoke song?
Oh, I know this one.
That was quick. Okay. Well, mine would be Backstreet Boys. I Want It That Way. You are my fire, my one desire. I can keep going. I love it so much.
Do you do all the moves as well?
I know the moves very, very
do you put
well.
Your white suit on?
Oh, the white suit. And if you go to some sort of, air hanger place, that I would definitely know all of the moves and all the little intricacies, all the little vocal sections.
Yeah. I feel like I could be a backup dancer for that.
Oh, let's do it. Okay. And now, Claire, you were very quick to respond as well. What's yours?
So mine would be anything by Shania Twain. I know, old school, to the point where all my mates at the gym know this. So if this comes on the playlist, I just get given the floor. So I have regular practice of my karaoke songs.
Could you give us a line from Shania?
Oh, man, I feel like a woman.
I love it. Okay. Ash, it's your turn. You asked a big question. Now it's your turn.
I'm going to regret this. My go-to karaoke song, for good or for bad, is Dance with Somebody by Whitney Houston.
Oh, that is a good one. Now we definitely need a line. Go, Ash.
Do we though?
Yes, we definitely do.
I want to dance with somebody.
I love it. That was great.
That's all you get. Sorry. It's normally under very different conditions that I am performing that song in karaoke.
Yeah, that was very good.
Yeah.
Well done. Thank you. That was actually a great question. I love more of those. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I'll keep them coming. But today we are not here to talk about karaoke.
Aren't we?
Unfortunately. We are here to review an article that was published by Claire and her team back in 2018 in BMC Pediatrics. The title of the article is A Realist Evaluation of a Physical Activity Participation Intervention for Children and Youth with Disabilities. What works, for whom, in what circumstances, and how? As you know, our guest today is lead author of this paper, Dr. Claire Willis. Claire is a lecturer and accredited exercise physiologist in the School of Allied Health, Human Services and Sport at La Trobe University. Previously, she's worked as a research fellow at the university and after completing her PhD. Claire's worked with children with disabilities all over the world, and this is how she developed her passion to contribute to paediatric health research. Claire's research focuses on development, evaluation and implementation of physical activity interventions and health promotion programs for children and young people with chronic and complex conditions. She has research collaborations with Beitostolen Healthsports Centre in Norway, where her work focused on evaluating interventions and strategies to promote and sustain participation in physical activity for children and young people with disabilities and complex medical conditions. More recently, Claire was the project manager of a multi-site clinical trial funded by the NHMRC on the feasibility and health economics of community-based exercise programs for young people with disabilities. Wearing the hat of accredited exercise physiologist as well as researcher means that Claire's a strong advocate for the role of exercise and physical activity for children and young people with disabilities. And that's why we feel so fortunate to be able to speak to her today.
Yay! Claire, what an incredible bio.
I was going to say that was very generous, a very generous introduction. Thanks, Ash. I think I keep it simple, and I just like working with kids to get them moving is really what I do.
One thing that I didn't mention in the bio, which I think is probably important for people to know, is that as part of, the process of developing this paper along with the other papers that formed part of your PhD, you actually learned to speak Norwegian, did you not?
True or false? That is correct. Whilst I was reassured by the centre over there that would not be necessary, I did find when I was over there that to engage best with the kids, it would be great if I could speak the language. And also just as even from an ethical perspective, being able to converse in someone's primary language is obviously really important. So I did. I took myself off to Norwegian school, and it led to some very funny conversations and interviews. And even particularly back when I got back to Australia and was transcribing a lot of the interviews that I'd done in Norwegian, you would often find me sitting in my office with my Norwegian dictionary out, a little bit rusty on the old Norwegian skills. So, but no, it was really good and really certainly enhanced my time over there. So
I call that commitment.
Gosh, I was going to say that is incredible. Well, on that, I'm going to go through the usual description of the study that we're going to talk about, and I'll go through the PICO format once again. Okay, so with regards to the population, they're children with a range of disabilities, of which there are 31, with a mean age of 12 years and 6 months, and as well as their parents, of which there are 44, 26 mothers and 18 fathers participated in this study. So this was a qualitative study using principles of realist evaluation with purposive and theoretical sampling of children and parents participating in the local environment model intervention at the Beitostolen Healthsports Centre in Norway. I hope I'm saying that right, but I'm just going to stick with it. So the local environment model is an intervention that was developed by this health sports centre to enable physical activity participation for children with disabilities in local environments. Essentially, it's goal-directed and family-centred, focusing on cooperation, education, and resource capacity. So the use of interviews as well as focus groups using an interview guide was then used and developed in assistance with a consumer group. And the semi-structured interviews explore the mechanisms, the context, and the outcomes based on the perspective of parents and children in the program. Now, the outcomes are really something that I can't wait to talk about today, because what they really did identify was the mechanisms of choice, fun, friends, specialised health professionals and time, activated in context that was safe, social, learning-based and family-centred, that elicited outcomes across all levels of the ICF. So this participation-based approach may act as a catalyst to promote a range of outcomes.
Lots of take-homes for our clinicians listening today.
Yeah, this is going to be an incredible one.
But before we get into the details of the results of your study, Claire, we thought that perhaps you might be able to spend a little bit of time explaining to the listeners what a realist evaluation is.
A realist evaluation is a way that we can identify the program mechanisms. So what is it that actually induces those changes after the intervention? Mm-hmm. It also identifies the features of the context. So what are the conditions that need to be there really to be able to operationalise those mechanisms? And then it also identifies the outcomes. So what are the intended but also unintended consequences of the intervention? And then after identifying all of those things, you create what's called a context mechanism outcome configuration. So original. But that's basically a fancy word for a model or a theory that describes the relationships between the context mechanisms and outcomes, ideally so that other researchers can either go and test it or other clinicians can pick up that model and apply it to their context to use in practice.
And so to tease out those relationships between context, mechanism and outcome, I imagine, and from reading your paper, the qualitative component of your work plays a really big role in being able to identify and then link those three components of the model together. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So to be able to collect all of our data, we used what we called an ethnographic approach, which was basically me immersing myself in the the centre, which it also involved learning the language and living at the centre and doing all of these things. So there was two main methods of data collection. We had the interviews and the focus groups, and then we also had what we call participant observation, where I was there as an overt observer. So they knew that I was there observing everything that was happening at the centre at the time. And from all of the data that we got from the interviews and from the observation, we were then able to identify all of those linkages between the context mechanisms and outcomes, to the point where we almost did this with every sentence. So it was actually quite amazing how children and families would just talk this way without even realising it. So they would say something along the lines of, I learned a lot of different things here, which referred to the context, and being able to have a choice in the activities I did meant that X, Y, and Z happened. So they were almost talking in this context mechanism outcome configuration as it was. So it made identifying the linkages and the relationships really clear.
What a great model. I love how you've explained it so beautifully there for people who might not be really experienced with regards to using the realist evaluation. But when you're talking about the CMO, context mechanism outcome, and you're linking it in with perspectives with regards to a qualitative study, it just makes sense. And I love the model that can be really easily translated from what you've done there to any other environment.
Particularly because we're looking at participation as our primary outcome, which we know is so intimately linked with the environment and context. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to replicate it exactly. So with our model, what we've said is, in fact, it might be better to interpret the findings of this or look at this model in the context of broader frameworks. So things like the ICF or even the F words, which you can draw parallels to as well. So what from this can you take that would suit the individual or the group of individuals in the setting that you're working in?
Yeah, so it's not that sort of cookie cutter that can you be in danger of doing and not being culturally sensitive to the environment that you're actually in. So, it's a beautiful model without being prescriptive in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And so at the risk of kind of oversimplifying things a little bit, because the model that you presented in the paper is a really rich one, and it's very clear to see the links and the relationships between the context mechanisms and outcomes. But we just wanted to touch on, I suppose, what the key themes were across each of those aspects of your paper. So for the context, there were 4 main themes that you identified within the context. Do you want to kind of talk to us a little bit about what those are?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think whilst no context or no context mechanism or outcome was more important than the other, I do think the contextual factors or these different contexts, and in particular the safe context that we identified, was something that really stood out to us as part of this research, and was perhaps something a little bit novel that hadn't previously come out within participation research prior to this. So there were 4 different contexts that we identified, that the children and parents identified, that helped to operationalise those mechanisms to induce those outcomes. And they were a family context, a safe context, a social context, and a learning context. And I'll just use the safe context as an example because I think it shows really nicely the relationships between the context and then the mechanisms and then the outcomes. But children and families spoke about how when they first arrived at the centre, it's obviously a new and novel place, which is often the case for children when they're arriving at a new place in the community where they might be participating in a different sport. And they were often quite fearful and withdrawn and unsure, and it was their family that initially provided that sense of security. But as time went on, and time was an important mechanism that I'm sure we'll talk about down the track, but they found that as their relationships with the staff or the health professionals that were at the centre got stronger and that they got to meet the other children there, their reliance on their family sort of dissipated a little bit, and they felt safe because of the strength of those relationships they were developing with other people. And for children, it was about they needed to feel safe in order to participate and to feel like they were learning different things.
And you've got this lovely quote here in your study where a child, 17 years old, said, "I feel like I can try new things because I feel safe here." I think that sums it up so beautifully in terms of what safe means and what we can do as health professionals to create that kind of context and ensure that that's featured.
Yeah, and have an understanding and an appreciation of that process, and that, you know, time does play a bit of a role in how the context can change and what the priorities are.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think particularly with, it's a family-centred program, so there's families involved throughout different stages of the intervention, but particularly in those initial stages was where both children and parents identified where that family involvement was particularly important because that led to that initial involvement in that particular setting in that situation as well.
It highlights that family-centred approach, doesn't it? It actually, a lot of this work that you're talking about, it just links in really nicely with models that we know are the leading models of how we should be providing care in the area of childhood disability. So it's not surprising to think that family is an important component of it. And with regards to learning and social and safe, it's just a beautiful way of describing it.
Thanks. I think the kids did most of the work describing that. We just joined it all together.
Yeah, that's really, really cool.
And so the next thing we wanted to touch on were those mechanisms that you've kind of alluded to when talking about the context, because as we said, they are all interrelated and important to one another. But I just wanted to touch on one specific mechanism, which was the specialised health professionals. And I'm sure clinicians listening, their ears prick up at that. But could you talk to us a little bit about what role the health professionals played within this model?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think across, intervention literature, it's well known, and even health professionals would know that their practices and behaviours are, of course, a mechanism of intervention effectiveness. So it's not necessarily a new finding, but I think what stood out with this research was perhaps just the approach and the philosophies the staff were basing their practices on. So which might be a little bit different to traditional or more conventional therapy settings in the sense that the staff didn't approach their program delivery through a therapeutic lens. It was very much through a pedagogical or a teaching lens, so that the focus was really on empowerment and not just for the children. It was also, there's a different paper on this, but also involving families in the process as well, so that everybody could learn and everybody could participate long term after the intervention had finished as well. So it's also worth mentioning.
Can I tease that out just a little bit with regards to that differentiation just before we go on? I'm really curious to see, so can you give us an example of how something very therapeutic looks versus one that is very much in a teaching? Can you give us an example of what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So I think for example, in Norway, when another component of what they're doing is very much around adapting environments or changing environments. So the intervention is really about focusing on changing body function or structure or intervening at the level of activity to then see a change in participation. Most of the time the intervention is targeted at that participation level where if children have a goal to ride a bike, then the intervention is riding the bike. And how do we change that by either providing different equipment or rather than the therapist providing the equipment, directing the families to where they can find that equipment. How can they change equipment that they've already got to be able to facilitate participation in that activity?
That's a great example. Thank you for teasing that out, because I think that's the part where I think we go, how do we do this? Because it is a mindset sort of shift, isn't it? It's very different to how health professionals would be often providing their therapy. It's a very participation-focused intervention, if you wanted to call it anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's probably something else that is a real theme of this paper in particular, where whilst participation was obviously the outcome and the goal that everybody was working towards, participation was also the means in which the goal was achieved. as well. So it has that twofold meaning and applicability.
Yeah, rather than expecting those downstream effects, you're kind of heading straight to the point that you want to have the impact and focusing your intervention there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's quite a shift from where we've approached participation in the past, in the sense that we often had this implicit assumption that if we intervene at the level of body function, then we'll see changes in activity capacity, and then we'll see changes in participation in life situations. But we've actually got very little evidence that supports that approach. So we've gone back to the drawing board, and we've got lots of other ones now that we know allow children and young people with disabilities to participate.
I love that shift, and I love that, we're looking as a research group starting to explore that, because I think that's the part that's been necessary, and families, children have been calling out for that. So absolutely. I love how that element has been in there. So can we move now from that mechanism of specialised health professionals? I really want to talk about what you mentioned earlier, and I definitely want to talk about with regards to time. Time is something that I feel very, very passionate about. Can you describe to us what you mean by time?
Yeah, absolutely. So time was identified by parents actually as a mechanism that impacted all of the outcomes. And I think one parent put it really nicely in the sense that she described time as being so important because it meant that the children weren't stressed with change. And so often we think with interventions, time is looked at or explored from maybe an intensive intervention perspective, where we're thinking the amount of time, so a number of hours, whereas time in this sense was more of a construct where time, we're thinking this is a 3-week intervention where children are there every day. So by that description, it would be intensive. But parents perceive time to allow those safe contexts to be created.
Yeah.
Time allowed those friendships and relationships with the staff and the children to develop. And then all of that together allowed those safe learning environments where children felt that they could participate and were involved in lots of different activities. So time, it's a resource when it's available, and then when it's not, it's a barrier. But time from a participation sense, what we're trying to say in this paper is that it plays quite an important role in constructing those really important contexts that help to lead to those meaningful outcomes.
And it's not necessarily just about a dosage per se.
No. And I think we also need to think about time in the acute sense. So if we're working with a child in an intervention, they're over that short period of time, their preferences for an activity or enjoyment of an activity might change, and time allows that to evolve. So there was a nice example given in the study, I think, where a girl at the beginning was a hard no on horse riding and didn't want to go anywhere near a horse. And over time, she used to visit the horses, and then she went and sat on a horse. And then by the end of it, she actually loved horse riding. So there's those examples. So I think we as clinicians, but even also as parents, need to be open to the fact that those preferences and experiences might change in the short term, but also across the lifespan. We need to acknowledge that our participation preferences are absolutely going to change over time, over different age brackets, and different supports might be required over time in order to facilitate participation as well.
It's that whole time and opportunity, isn't it? It's the ability to just have preferences, and I see how all those things of choice are really linking in, because I see that one of the other mechanisms for the child was choice, and I feel like they seem, it's quite interesting that for parents they identified time, and for children they identified choice. And I think that's actually just describes the story really nicely, and what we need to do to allow that opportunity for that to come about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that the children, as part of that choice mechanism, was just the exposure to a lot of different opportunities or activities that they might not have previously had the opportunity to participate in or felt comfortable participating in, whereas this environment enabled them the opportunity to do that. So I think choice and variety, novel experiences, it was all tied in together.
Yeah, and even on that then, I love how it all just links in so well. And you spoke a little bit about, the F words. The F words is this very strengths-based lens now that we're looking at things, aren't we? And two of the other mechanisms was fun and friends, and that sounds very much like the F words. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know we've kind of talked about friends in a way now, but yeah, let's just look at those two elements really specifically and what actually happened within the program to foster friends and fun. Like, how did that look like?
Yeah, definitely. So I love the F words. I think that's just such a fantastic framework, and it's really the answer to all life's questions, I think. If anything, this paper might narrow in on that framework a little bit, and perhaps and even look at exploring some of the transactions between the fun and the friends and the future and function and things like that. But looking at fun and friends, so fun, it was actually observed quite differently between parents and children. So for children, it was absolutely essential that the activities needed to be fun for them to be having a good time, really. And I think that's universal, regardless of whether or who you are or what you're doing. That's almost human nature. Whereas the parents, they did believe in the value of fun of the program, but for them, they also recognised fun as what they called a covert mechanism to also work towards achieving some of those more body function and activity level goals that were important to them. And they saw that the children were so engaged in these activities, and I mean they were doing say 5 hours of activities a day, but they also commented on how quickly they observed those changes just because the children were participating in these things, not only during the program sessions, but time out of the intervention when everyone's got free time, the kids would make the choice to go racing around on their bikes together or, go and play throw and catch in their own time. So, it was probably a double-edged sword there with fun. And then Friends was quite unique because it was identified as both a mechanism and an outcome. So Friends were important to elicit some of the outcomes, but then it was also having friends was an outcome in itself. And there are quite a few nice quotes in the paper where the children talk about how for them this was where they made their first friend, or now they have lots of friends, and for that the quantification of how many friends they had was really important to them.
Yeah. See, it's none of these things we're talking necessarily are just absolute rocket science, but you really are highlighting the key features that we can implement into what we're doing. And if we already are incorporating it, well, we're partway there already. Yeah. So it's so encouraging to read this.
For sure.
Definitely. And I was just going to say, I think the way that the children and families described, in particular those two things, was comparing them to other contexts. So, for example, school or at home and in their local neighbourhood where those things might not exist. And they talked about the isolation or the loneliness that they felt compared to here, which was really different. So I think those two, like you say it's not rocket science. It is really obvious, but they are really meaningful to children and families as well.
And so finally, Claire, we've kind of touched on it a little bit because they are also interrelated, but the other outcomes that formed part of your model, we've talked about friends being a mechanism as well as an outcome, but what were some of the other outcomes that you saw?
Oh, there were quite a few. But and again, I think one of there are probably two that stand out to me. And probably the first one was enjoyment in physical activity. Yeah. So that's when we're thinking of physical activity participation, we're really talking about physical activity behaviours and really thinking along this line of behaviour change and how can we participate across the lifespan and ensure that these changes that occur during an intervention are maintained and sustained beyond that. And enjoying physical activity we know this from physical activity literature generally, that's a really, really important part of it. So, again, maybe not a groundbreaking revelation, but an important one, which also might explain from some of our other work why we do see the longer term maintenance of the outcomes as well. And one of the other ones that parents, again, identified that I brought up before was around changes at the body function and activity level. So things like balance and a child's confidence and their mood and things like that were really meaningful to parents. And it was something that within the paper we, at the time, posited this question or hypothesised, well, do participation-focused interventions have the potential to make changes at a body function and activity level? And within our qualitative research, that's not something that we were able to say yes or no to. We had some exploratory evidence to suggest it might be worth further investigation. And there's actually Dana Adavy's published a really nice paper that has answered that question, or is a starting point to answer that question for us as well. So there's lots of future research that can happen in that space for sure.
That leads me beautifully into my next question, which is, given everything that you've learned as part of this paper and I suppose and the larger body of work as a whole, where would you see the future research questions heading towards?
Yeah, well, I think in addition to this research, there's been lots of other researchers in the last couple of years publish interventions that are very different to this that have shown to be effective in enabling children to achieve their physical activity participation goals. And so, again, I go all the way back to the start where I talked about those two questions when we're evaluating interventions. We've got quite a number of different interventions now that do work. So the good news is that we know that we can intervene effectively at the level of participation. And so the next steps, I think, now are, can we look at those interventions and what are the active ingredients of those interventions? Are there common elements across all of the interventions that are working towards making changes in participation? And what can we learn from them? So it doesn't necessarily mean everyone needs to go and do a realist evaluation, but I think there's things that we can certainly learn from each other. And the fact that there are now a number of quite different interventions that have been shown to be effective, it also means that we also have a choice because, like we talked about earlier, not every intervention is going to be ideal for every setting. So it does give clinicians and health professionals out there the options to have a look at what might work in their context.
And that's so encouraging. Look, I think that what we've spoken about today is going to be so encouraging for so many clinicians and researchers out there. Now, we have the best opportunity now to just be able to describe that to anyone. So that is really the segue into Tell It to Ed. So Tell It to Ed is the 60-second pitch to the common man Ed. This segment is all about telling Ed, our lovely producer, who has no background in child health or research, a little bit about the paper itself and to be able to tell him what the main points might be. And this will assist us in telling families about the paper as well. So welcome to the show, Ed. Head to the mic.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, Ed, thank you for being here. I think we couldn't actually do this without you anyway.
Definitely not.
Absolutely not.
All right, Claire, in 60 seconds or so, can you describe the paper and the main findings to Ed?
Yeah, sure. So, hey, Ed, thanks for the invitation to share my research with you.
No problems. Happy to have you on my show.
Do I have a timer on? Is there a 60-second bell?
60 seconds. I'll start waving about the place.
Okay. All right. So here we go. All right. So understanding how interventions work is a really important part of implementing effective interventions into practice. And so this is what our research was focused on, identifying the features of an intervention that enabled children with disabilities to achieve their physical activity participation goals. And what they told us was that to meaningfully participate, they need a place where they feel safe, where they have new activities to learn, where their family is there sometimes, and where there are other children like them. It's important that they can make choices, that they have fun, make friends, can take as much time as they need, and that there are people there that know how to support them. And together, this helps them to achieve their goals and think of even more, and importantly, enjoy physical activity. And remember, even though participation is your goal, participation can also be the intervention, which might promote other meaningful outcomes for children and families as well.
Oh, that was a great summary.
Very cool.
Now, Ed,
Thanks.
do you have any questions for Claire?
I probably have too many questions for Claire. So
Just the one.
Okay. Let's try to bring it to something that's practical in my mind. Obviously, like, I'm not a clinician, so I don't understand like what's involved with interventions. But from a participation point of view, obviously, lots of kids love to be involved in sport and physical activity. And if I'm thinking of as a clinician, there's a client or a patient that has an interest in, say, a sport like basketball. How would I go about getting them involved in some sort of like wheelchair basketball if that, like, they have some mobility limitations, and how would that look like?
That's a great question. And I think that's possibly something we didn't really touch on. So this is a good segue, Ed, in terms of what does this look like in practice? So practically, what can clinicians do? What can health professionals do when children, like Ed's example, come to them with a goal like wanting to play basketball? Not all of us, and probably very few of us, are in these settings like the Norway setup. But what we do have are, I think a lot of the time, communities where there are a lot of different sport and recreation and leisure services that exist in the community, whether they be mainstream sport, or whether they're set up like an organisation like wheelchair basketball that exists. So one of the big things that I think clinicians need to take away is that we do need to change our practice a little bit, or think outside the box when we're doing things like this. Again, using this participation-focused approach, we tend to jump straight in. So really looking around the community and seeing what resources already exist. I'm not a basketball expert, absolutely not. But there are definitely basketball experts out there who together, if we join forces, we can create different inclusive opportunities. So that might be heading straight to the Wheelchair Basketball Association if that's the right setting for the child that you're working with. Or it might be that they're really keen to participate in their school basketball team. So do we need to actually work together with the school? And can we have the whole class having a go at wheelchair basketball as well? Different things like that. So I think it's no longer okay to just be handing out information for families. I think we need to be more proactive in doing this, attending sessions if that's what's required and that's what the family would like, while also acknowledging that there's a different financial model that might need to be around to support something like that. So this is something that I think over time will need to be backed that way as well. So, and, you know, the NDIS does allow that to some extent in Australia.
Well, Ed, you ended up asking a very big question, but I think it's been really amazing for you to actually just talk that part of it through, because, again, as we can all hear, the focus is very different and you are approaching it from a very different avenue, but it's something that's very possible that you can just start to do straight up from there. So, Claire, thank you so much for being on the ResearchWorks podcast. Remember, to everyone, the run sheet notes or the show notes will be available on our website, researchworks.net. And if you want this recorded as part of your CPD requirements, there is a form you can fill out on the website as well with some reflection notes so you can keep this as part of your PD requirements.
Well, next week we have clinical professor Dr. Jane Valentine joining us. Jane is a paediatric rehabilitation physician and head of research in the Kids Rehab WA department at the Perth Children's Hospital in Western Australia. Her article titled Botulinum Toxin and Surgical Intervention in Children and Adolescents with Cerebral Palsy, Who, When and Why Do We Treat, is such an important piece of work because it not only helps us direct and plan services, but can also be useful in discussion with families with regards to potential medical and surgical interventions. We hope you can join us next week. Claire, a big thank you. We could talk to you about this topic all day. And we might continue to do so after we sign off.
I think we might.
But yeah, a huge thanks for your time. I got a lot out of it. I'm sure our listeners will get a lot out of it. And yeah, we're very grateful.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you so
It was
much.
an honour to be involved. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.